You talk about confusing relief with resolution in your own life. Can you walk us through a moment where you reached for relief and what the question underneath it actually turned out to be? So, in your book, you speak about confusing relief and resolution within your own space and in your own life. So, what I'm looking for is an example and a walkthrough of a moment where you reached for relief and you got that relief, and what was the question that was underneath it that led to that relief instead of a resolution.
So I think it's the other way around, right? So
Yes.
the relief is what we seek as short term. The resolution is staying with the question. I think the easiest way to explain this is struggling with loss and not really knowing how to grieve loss in my life. And the idea that when I found myself in situations where I was confronted with loss, and loss didn't just mean somebody passing away. So, it could be a friendship, it could have been a business, it could have been just that idea that I no longer have this in my life, and struggled with that for many years. And the relief was always avoidance. I would particularly shelve it and not want to deal with it because it was too difficult, because it was too hard, because I didn't know how, which is what I later found out, which I realized later, and I'll get to in a moment. But it's interesting because relief from feeling that way comes in different forms. For me, it was mostly avoidance that just if I don't deal with it, then it's not happening. So denial almost of, that it's actually even affecting me. The idea that came up in one of my own self-coaching sessions as I was working through my own book is, being authentic and just seeing how well it works and testing this out. It came up again that there was this idea of loss. And I know that what transpired was a question around how I could face loss without trying to solve it. Because it's not something you get to solve as a problem. It's something you get to sit with, as in the case of grief. And whilst I haven't quite figured out yet what it feels like to grieve as a process, what I have started to experience, and it's not a definitive process that ends. It's an ongoing thing. But what I've started to notice is that when I think back to some of the losses I've experienced in my life, they have less of an impact on me today than they did, say, 3 or 6 or 9 months ago. So grieving loss is as a process for me, not the easiest thing. And whilst I seek the relief of grief, from grief, actually, I don't think something in this case that particularly ends, which is a really good example of, how do I grieve my losses? What do I need to do to grieve my losses in life as a question becomes an ongoing question. And somehow, in my experience, that starts to resolve some of the feelings that I still carry from the past. So the resolution here is not trying to fix it in the short term, but sitting with it long enough that the process of grief starts to happen because I'm asking myself to do that. And these things come up and I feel them and I notice them, and but I don't get caught and stuck in them. And I don't try and stop them because I don't like how it feels.
Grief as a question is an interesting one. Like, so many people sit with grief for so many different reasons.
Yes.
And like you said, it couldn't be the loss of a loved one, but it can also be the loss of a friendship, the loss of a business, something that you're grieving. And it's so easy to get stuck in it and want that to go away, to want that relief. But the not looking for that relief and rather asking it as a question to find long-term resolution ultimately helps you to go through that process, it sounds like.
It not just helps go through the process, but helps stay with the process, because now you're sitting with that question, how do I grieve my losses? And I keep coming back to that question, and I sit with that every time I feel something and I think about something that I've lost. It's like, okay, well, what do I need to do right now to grieve that loss? And not have to have a cognitive answer, but just noticing the question, noticing the feeling at the time is the process.
Sure. Okay, well, that is actually an interesting take on it. And you're speaking a little bit about the process. And if we go back to the process sort of the stay with the question self-coaching process, in your book, you wrote that you consistently mistook one stage of the process for the whole process. So when did you sort of first realize that you were doing that with your clients, and what, in your estimation and experience, that was it costing them?
We try and answer questions because we don't like unanswered questions. And our natural tendency is to go and find an answer. And we were raised this way. We were tested at school. If you don't know the answer, you're going to fail. So you have to find an answer. And it becomes such an important thing that, oh, I've got a question, I've got a problem, I've got a struggle, I need to make a decision, I have to have an answer. And I will fight tooth and nail at that moment to have an answer so that I can feel that relief that we were talking about earlier. I can feel that relief of having the answer. So asking a question is, and getting an answer is part of the process. But if I allow myself to keep coming back to the question and I pay attention to the answers that come up, but I keep asking, I'll keep coming up with new answers that I might not have otherwise experienced or come to know, because my brain is now looking for an answer. And sometimes it's frustrating because I can hear my brain saying to me, but I've given you 20 answers. Like, how many do you want? But somehow there's a shift. And the whole thing starts to become apparent in lives of my clients when they are willing to stay with that discomfort for a while and understand and come to know that the question is continuously serving them, that they haven't stopped seeking, that there might be better possibilities, there might be other experiences, there might be other answers out there that without staying with the question, they might not have found. And I can't tell you my clients' stories, but I can tell you that the feedback that I get is that one well placed, well found question can be life changing, because perspective changes, not immediately, sometimes takes time, but also perception changes, because now I'm sitting and I'm okay with the fact that I don't have the right answer yet. And sometimes we feel that an answer comes and we go, that's it. That's the right one. My encouragement is don't stop. Go back to the question, stay with the question, see what happens. Maybe nothing happens. That's okay. But the whole process of just asking a question, getting an answer, going on to the next question, getting an answer serves, and it helps. And we in coaching create action items, but what I also found was that sometimes clients keep coming back saying, yes, I've done this, I've committed, and I've completed my action item, I've completed my to-do list, I've done what I said I would do, and yet nothing's changed.
Okay. So that's interesting, because it's almost a challenge of the belief that if you follow a certain process, that this is the process and it's going to get resolved. But taking that as the whole process while almost missing the section of actually finding that right question can sometimes leave ourselves or our clients at a loss for coming to a better conclusion or resolution or understanding, whatever that may be.
If it's a superficial type question, and I don't mean the person superficial, I mean if it's a question around, I need to create a strategy for my business. Okay, well, let's coach you to find the strategy. Found the strategy, you're happy with the strategy. That's great. If we'd asked a different question, like what do I need to change within me in order to come up with a better strategy, or what needs to be different in my world and how I engage my company, what kind of strategy might come out of that? And then I stay with that, because now it's about me, not just what I do. And how do I portray my own beliefs, my own values into the strategy? And maybe it takes time for that to filter through. And if I keep coming back to who am I in the midst of this strategy? How do I portray my values in this, in coming up with this strategy? And keep coming back to that question, I'm going to potentially come up with different answers that might have more impact, more efficacy, depending on what it is I'm trying to achieve.
Okay, so from a coaching perspective, even this really is like a true representation of that principle of coach the who, not the what.
Because asking the question about what needs to be true for me, or how do I change this, or what do I need, who do I need to become in order for this to happen, then starts to transform people at the who level, and that ideally should take care of the what.
Okay, actually, that's a different perspective on it, but something that sounds like a really, really effective perspective, essentially. Okay, so one of our next questions was around this concept of the revolving door question. So you describe this revolving door question and it generates movement. And you sort of touched on it a little bit by speaking about that to-do list, but it doesn't necessarily generate progress. So if you if you were somebody who'd read your book, how would that person recognize that they're inside one of these revolving door questions, especially when they've been thinking hard about something for months?
Such a good question. So, and it happens in so many different ways, but intrinsically we know when we're stuck because we keep trying to solve the same problem. Sometimes it's the same problem dressed up differently, right? So why does this keep happening to me? I keep doing what I'm supposed to be doing, yet nothing changes. Or why does this problem keep coming back? Why is it that my company is not growing? I'm doing all the right things. Why are my relationships not getting better? All kinds of things that we know that when we're dwelling on them and nothing's changing, we're stuck in this revolving door of think about it, find an answer, go back, think about it, find an answer. But the revolving door is not changing even the nature of the question. It's I've got a problem, I need a solution. When I stop spinning in that revolving door and I take a breath and I look at what it is I'm really trying to solve for here, and I'm able to go deeper into understanding what lies beneath the question. Why am I asking this question? Why is this a problem? What's really going on here? And when I get to the bottom of that and I turn that into a question and shape that question into something that I can stay with, then I'm not waiting for an answer and then going to go on to something else. I'm going to change my patterning, my approach by continuously coming back to that question that I've uncovered in that, by reading my book, by coming to me for a coaching session, whatever it might be. And by staying now with that question on an ongoing basis starts to shape my decisions, my observations, my choices, my mindset around what that actually means. And I start to see things in a different way. I start to notice things differently because my brain is looking for answers. And if I don't switch that off, essentially I'm maintaining curiosity. And curiosity is part of that key to unlocking that revolving door and stopping that internal spinning.
Almost sort of replicates the exit from that fight or flight area to rest and digest area, what is what I'm hearing.
It can be quite triggering not to have an answer because we perceive that as a threat and it can be triggering. But I do teach in my book how to just regulate and just stay with that and notice the discomfort and be okay with the discomfort for a little bit and start to notice what starts to change. When the brain realizes that it's actually good not to have an answer, it starts to let go of that idea that, oh, I need an answer, I have to have an answer. So it's a process and it's a almost like building new neural pathways in the brain to say, actually, it's not a threat. Not knowing the answer right now is not a threat because look at this trajectory that I'm now on. Look at the path that I'm now forging. Look at the new discoveries that I'm making, whatever it might be, as I stay with that process of staying with the question.
It's actually interesting that you spoke about that sort of fear and it being triggering, because one of the things that you speak about quite a lot in your book is that the quality of your life is determined by the quality of the question that you stay with, not actually the answer that you find. And One of the last things that I want to touch on today is what does staying with a question actually look like in practice, sort of day to day? Because for most people viewing and anybody who might be interested in something like this, sitting with uncertainty can feel like a failure. And it sort of comes back to that triggering that you spoke about earlier. So, what would you say that would actually look like in practice day to day?
Think if what you need is an immediate answer and a solution to a problem, this process is not the right process. If you're tired of trying to fix things the same way, right? Einstein said, yeah, you cannot solve problems at the same level that they were created. Meaning that if I'm sitting with a problem and I'm panicking because I don't have an answer, my boss is chasing me or whatever it might be, then I need to go and find that answer, right? Because otherwise I'm going to be in trouble, right? But if I'm have the capacity to stay with that for a little bit, I might start to see that I start to change how my brain engages with that problem, not to simply find an immediate answer, but to explore the different possibilities that might exist around that and even come up with a better answer. It does require a calm setting and a calm mind because we're using a different part of our brain. We're particularly using the part of brain that is not flight or fight in order to explore these questions and what becomes possible. So really what possibilities arise by noticing and staying with the question, observing the answer, parking it, writing it down, make a note of it. They're all valid potentially. Some are better, some might not be. That's okay. And you can evaluate them as they come along. But when the brain is now in this mode of staying with the question, it becomes more aware of it. There's a post on LinkedIn and something in the post catches our eye. Because remember, we're taking in so much more information than we're cognitively aware of. Our brain is processing huge amounts of information. So there'll be one or two words in a LinkedIn post as we're scrolling past. And it's like, wait, what was that? Because your brain's looking out for it. If your brain's not looking out for it, you might just scroll past it and miss it. So by staying with the question, you're asking the brain to become more aware of its surroundings, become more aware of possible solutions to that problem. And once you've explored that for a while and you start to find some answers, you might find some of them are better answers than you would have if you'd just taken the first one or the second or the third. The other part of it, and this is where it gets really interesting, if the problem dives right underneath the problem itself into an identity level type of question. So, who do I need to be as a leader? Who do I need to be as a husband, a father? So, who am I type of question? Staying with that question then starts to have an impact on the choices that I make because there is no solution here. Who am I as a father is an ongoing developing process that started before my child was even conceived, right? I was already starting to ask those questions, and I still ask that question today, but I've not asked it in a singular question about my identity as a father, which I've now subsequently started doing, is in this moment, because I've got this unanswered question, who am I as my daughter's father? My approach to some of the things, some of the engagements that we have are slightly different. I worry about different things. I don't think you can ever stop worrying as a parent, but I worry about different things because my mindset is changing. My identity around being a father starts to shift because I start to notice things differently. She'll say something, and my response is different to what it used to be. And I'll sit there thinking, oh, something's changed. Yeah, maybe I can't quite put my finger on it, but I like this newer father version of me. So because it's unanswered and it stays unanswered, and I keep coming back, because that was a great answer. Okay, so that's what it looks like to be a better father, right? And I go back to the question, the next situation arises, right? And I respond slightly differently to what I would have. And I'm not saying that personal growth doesn't happen anyway, but it sets a trajectory of growth if we allow ourselves to stay with the unanswered question.
Sure. So what I'm hearing is that these questions left unanswered actually have the ability to shape our entire identity in a different direction that we may not even have necessarily been equipped to do before we ask the question.
And therein exactly lies the problem that we face. I go and I read books and I find answers about what I need to do to be a better father. And I read all these books and I get all these answers and I go, right, I'm going to do this and this and this and this. And the first situation that pops up, I look at this and I go, I don't have an answer because everything I've read doesn't apply to this situation. And I think a lot of people might notice that has happened more than once in their life. And it can be about any part of who we are. What the question does is allow for not knowing. It allows us to be okay with not having all the answers all the time. Because when I need the answer, because my brain is saying, how do I be a better father to my daughter? And she says to me, Dad, this is what's going on. My brain is now looking for what does better father mean in this moment. And that's what really matters. How do I show up as a leader in that moment? How do I show up as a human being, as a energetic human being, as a spiritual being, as a whatever it is that I'm seeking? That it's not about the answer, it's about the choice that I make in that moment that now aligns to that unanswered question. My purpose might be to be the worst father I can be, right? And my choices would be radically different. That's your choice, right? If that's who you want to be. But your choices now, your behaviors start to now align potentially to your value. Because how do I be the most trusting person in the world, right? I want to be very trusting and people must trust me and be trustworthy. Okay, that's great. There's no definitive answer about, well, you have to do this and you have to do that. Some of them work. Yeah. Be honest, be integrous. All of those things are really good at building trust. But in that moment, if my brain is looking for the answer of who do I need to be a trustworthy person in my life, in that moment, the choice that I make now starts to align to being trustworthy. Because
That's
the moment I'm
interesting.
trying to make a different choice, my brain says, no, that's not the right answer. And we know that we have this, we call it gut feeling. So it starts to invite gut feelings into the equation because there's a knowingness. We know whether we're aligned or not to that question. That's what emotions and feelings are for, is to tell us when we're not making the right choices that align to who we say we want to be.
And it's so true because practically that is what you see after these sessions. I mean, I've had the privilege of having a session like this, and it's exactly that experience of I don't really know what the answer is, but I know that this is no closer to it. Or I know this is moving in the wrong direction away from the answer to this question. There is that, like you call it, a knowing and a gut feeling, inviting gut feelings into the equation that say to us, this is who you're trying to be. This is the identity that you're trying to form. And this is not in line with that. I don't know the answer, but this is not in line with that.
And I'm also not so bent on having to find an answer that I ignore my gut instinct because I'm
Okay.
okay now with not having the answer. I'm okay with staying with the question. And as I'm saying this out loud, I've never really connected intuition into all of this, and it should have been a part of the book, but it's too late now.
It's fine. There can be a version two. There can be a follow-up.